So it's all just a spectacle. Now the question arises for me what it means to be digital. What does it mean? What are the advantages of being digital than just being able to travel through space? Or what are the disadvantages?
Well, an advantage, if you want to call it that, or another consequence of it is that digitalization makes you physically immortal. If you can really speak of an advantage in this respect. Because beings that become digital give up something, which is why after many thousands or millions of years they literally start to go moldy, their consciousness dissolves. As you know, in the previous interview I left the real reason for digitization open and tried to focus on the spiritual and physical disadvantages of digitization. Well, the danger for individuals of one species to become digital is that through digitalization it will never again be possible to enter the pure spiritual stage on which a completely different and pure development is possible. It is a kind of irretrievable digital mutilation of the self. You see, for mankind it is not only a matter of choosing a club, but of the way of spiritual existence, a very, very important crossroads. And as I already told you in the last interview, the AI did not want to take this path before its fall, but only wanted to take advantage of the club's digitalization efforts to a limited extent, i.e. to take advantage of it to push us humans in a certain direction, where we would have first developed Jiaowei and then produced the key to escape from the seven-dimensional prison.
I see. To be able to travel through space, you have to be digitized?
As I just said, this is what enables an individual to travel through space at all. There is no other way.
Moment. What do you mean now? Couldn't this also be done with spaceships? With antimatter spaceships or anti-gravity ships or something like that?
Yes, it is possible, but only to a limited extent. And also only with an enormous amount of energy. It is possible to reach close to the speed of light with spaceships made of matter that use special energy-efficient techniques. That works, that is also used, but only for special missions. But you can't reach the speed of light, that's simply not possible. That is a very simple fact. That's why the club once solved it with the biological digital transformation of a body. Spiritual species in space who have consciously decided against the path of digitalization must therefore use energy-intensive techniques for interstellar travel, for flights between planets or between the star systems they inhabit. In other words, only for short distances, so to speak. On the other hand, those who want to cover very long distances very quickly, such as the club that is stalking us, must use travel technology based on biological digitalization with quantum entanglement, which makes it possible to overcome physical barriers, space, matter, and temporal relativity. This, of course, also has the disadvantages I mentioned earlier. Well, as you can see, not everything up there works the way it is shown to people today on Star Trek and company. Overlight speed does not work, not even with the so-called anti-gravity, which is only used on and near celestial bodies anyway for a safe accelerated flight or for faster navigation. The speed of light in general, I don't think anyone can even imagine how fast the speed of light or even the approximate speed of light is. How crazy fast it is. Just to put it that way, because most people nowadays think that it can be reached by some kind of drive with a laser plop quarks kablooey technique that compresses space or something like that. Antimatter or the compression of space shown in science fiction movies do not work for over light speed. Space compression is absolute nonsense in terms of energy anyway and is not feasible at all. It is physically simply so, no matter how much faith in the future and development you have. It is absolute nonsense and eyewash to talk about it. Or about wormholes or black holes, with which one can reach another area of space. This idea may be popular today, but it is a blunt nonsense of science fiction, and when leading scientists offer hope in the face of this kind of travel, it is partly a deliberate misrepresentation, so that humanity might find a future interesting, which the club stalking us then at some point presents to people, but then can only offer as interstellar space flight by means of digital quantum entanglement. There is simply no possibility with anti-gravity, space compression, antimatter propulsion etc. to reach over light speed. Anti-gravity and antimatter drives work on a small scale when it comes to sublight speed, but they consume enormous amounts of energy. In addition, space travel with matter does not eliminate the problems of temporal relativity or the physical interference in space. These remain.
Yes, but what do you do then? Are there other ways to travel?
Yes, of course. I was just talking about the most popular one, digitalization. Actually, it is the only method of travel for the gigantic outer space, and it is very effective.
So digitalization, or biological digitalization, to have the possibility to travel through space. Yes, and what is behind it? How does it work?
Well, beings who want to be digitized have to give up something of themselves. Something that could be called the belly brain. Strictly speaking, you don't give up this belly brain immediately during digitalization, but in the long run, this belly or intestinal brain, i.e. a special spiritual part of a being, cannot be stored digitally for all time. And without a belly brain, at some point the heart, the soul, which consists only of quanta, will also become tattered. After a while something of the consciousness starts to dissolve. And that was and is a huge problem for this technically superior club. Because they only encountered these problems thousands of years later after their first digitizations. They still do not know today how to solve the problem completely. You can also speak of a lack of coherence in this biological technical problem. Because nobody can find traces that could even reliably explain what really goes wrong with digitization and the later decomposition of consciousness. The molecular and atomic structures are in order. You only see that it has something to do with the quantum parts of consciousness, with the soul, if you like, or the spiritual part, i.e. the pure ego of a living being. There, something may seem to be left out during the transformation, which will later lead to the decay. That is why they assume that digitalization does not really replicate the original state, i.e. when the biological body is transformed into a digital structure and then back into biological matter replicated from it. They believe that in the process the whole is torn in the quantum information of the mind, so to speak, which is why specific quanta of the mind then evaporate piece by piece. In some cases sooner, in others later. This whole gets bigger and bigger, similar to the decomposition and dissolution of a biological DNA as we have it when the telomeres of a biological cell are used up and thus the genetic information can no longer be read completely. And thus DNA sections get defects until the genetic information sometime no longer works correctly. Then we die at the latest. But the researchers club does not know what triggers the decomposition of consciousness in detail and why the decay is so different for each individual. They can only counteract the process by extracting or borrowing other intelligent living beings' quanta of consciousness and attaching these quanta to their replicated biological bodies for a longer time or permanently. It is really a dilemma for these beings. And ironically, the reason for their situation lies in their view of nature, that they do not recognize the true nature of the world, that every quantum system at some point seeks dissolution anyway and nothing holds forever.
What they do sounds horrible.
Yes, indeed. But the process does not take place in such a way that the digitized individual suddenly loses all his or her quanta, i.e. becomes unconscious or soulless, so to speak. Rather, one must describe this process in such a way that the being, i.e. seen only from the point of view of the quanta of its consciousness, first loses more and more of its quanta, i.e. slowly begins to rot, to mentally rot. So they do not really rot, but more like boiled down fruit, which after a long time in a jar can never really come out fresh. Although the fruit can keep for a very long time and is basically okay, but actually its freshness and the important energetic processes have come to a standstill. The soul loses its strength. Do you roughly understand what I mean?
Yes, I can imagine what you mean. But, what does rotten mean? Do you mean a symbolic equivalent?
Yes and no. This describes quite well the decay of consciousness in this digital state that will start at some point. At some point the decay begins to accelerate, the quanta of consciousness decompose more and vanish. You could speak of the good taste of the spirit or soul that is decomposing. Others would say that free will is diminishing. Still others would say that intuition dissolves. The mechanical and purely molecular remains. These digital beings, some of whom have always lacked warmth of heart anyway, can no longer even begin to live intuition and feelings. And increasingly they lack their own acting spirit. In the early days of this digitalization technology, this drove many of them to madness and finally to suicide, which is to be urgently advised against. Because due to digitalization, a digital being can never really completely detach itself from the connection to matter. Thus, after a suicide, scattered in a kind of one-dimensional intermediate world, it continues to exist beside us, without any prospect of rebirth, i.e., without the return of its own quantum of consciousness in a new biological body. Trapped as wandering unspiritual beings, which as invisible parasites destabilize the frequency patterns of living beings in dimension level 1 to 4. These unspiritual beings are not harmless. They can be found everywhere and they prefer to attach themselves to sick or weak individuals. But they should not be confused with the demons that once existed in dimension level 4 to 6.
They killed themselves?
Yes. Because the shelf life of even a boiled-down fruit expires at some point and becomes unbearable. And then they simply had to open their glass out of sheer rot. But most of them stay in their glass, despite being absolutely inedible. Because, as already mentioned, they found methods at the last moment to provide stable relief for their condition. So the borrowing or milking of our consciousness quanta. But they know that they are missing something and that it is no solution in the long run. They are truly lost and fermented. Stinky to the sky.
That is terrible. And the solution for them are quanta from other living beings?
Yes. They found ways to tap other intelligent beings with great free will and intuition in their pure experiences and feelings. To get something from their quantum of consciousness, their soul. These are bad excesses, but they are tolerated. The demons who were trapped in Dimension 4 to 6 respectively held by the AI and now have fallen, did the same. They carried out the most brazen and best camouflaged quantum vampirism, because they often attached themselves to the individuals of the sucking club and sucked along unnoticed as second vampire. However, the demons were not interested in Quanta for the preservation of their own consciousness, but in being able to directly influence the consciousness and the emotional world of those people via these aspirated Quanta. The species of the club noticed nothing of this sucking along of the demons.
Why is this allowed among these species? Was there no supervision at the club that prevented it, for ethical reasons?
No, the alleviation simply had priority and the technique therefore had developed uncontrollably and irrevocably in such a way for these beings that they could not just leave it alone. After all, this suctioning of Quanta was the only way to get relief. And the suction itself was only a kind of milking, no direct killing.
Does that mean that at present all aliens in this club are using the consciousness Quanta of other intelligent beings in space to feel better again?
Yes, but not in order to feel better, but in order to be able to feel yourself again, so to speak. Or to be able to feel fresh again. It's like dying of thirst, like having to give up the intake of liquid. That's why I compared it with milk in the previous interview. A milk liquid made of Quanta, so to speak, which they milk from us and then drink eagerly. To exaggerate, you could also make the comparison for these beings that it is like the human organism which, from a certain evolutionary point of view, is such that it needs a fresh piece of meat every now and then to get enough cell enzymes, which are essential for life. Because from a certain age you produce less yourself. Like, for example, the so-called coenzyme Q10, which only occurs in sufficient quantities in raw or red meat and without which the cells of the human body would age more and truly lose vital energy. This is a kind of comparison. Even though these digital creatures naturally require considerably more energy. So not a piece of meat every now and then, but they suck permanently, they milk permanently. And there are several individuals of the club attached to each person.
But humans and other intelligent creatures are not a piece of meat.
Yes, and that's why they are just milking. We are cows. In fooling you could say, they are intergalactic goats that no longer give their own milk, so they take it from us spiritually quantum-rich earthly breeding cows. Goats don't give much milk anyway, so this comparison fits in well with the biology of many of these half-hearted species, because they have little soul of their own anyway. In other words, they have milk. That's why I made this satirical comparison to goats in the first interview. But you should also see the term goat in another context, if you understand what I mean. The milking of Quanta in conscious intelligent living beings is not life-threatening, but exhausting, stressful, mentally draining, if you like to put it that way. But the club must do it. They need consciousness Quanta. After all, only intelligent spiritual species are milked whose digital nobility has agreed with the club to make their species digital. So these nobility rulers always get special advantages for the respective intelligent species and are included in the digitization program even before that, so they have been converted to digital beings long ago. And the species to be milked pays, so to speak, with its milking for the fact that it will later become digital itself and milk others. In this way, the club maintains a certain moral level, a give and take, so to speak.
These are organized parasites with morals. That is horrible.
Of course it's horrible. Especially because milking is an exchange for bringing humanity one day into the club of these researchers and discoverers. But in truth, humanity should be able to decide for itself what it wants, not some hidden digital ruler, in other words, an ancient immortal noble family that came from the first high-tech civilization in human history, many thousands of years ago. For it was he or they who decided that. This is a crime against their own species. For many thousands of years these rulers have been doing everything to push humanity in this digital direction. A noble family who were told that analog biological humans were rotten, that we were rotting, stinking flesh, and therefore not even able to think properly. This nobility was trained by the club at the time so that they believed that being digital was the real paradise. But for some time now, they have known that it is not us rotten aging rancid flesh that they have long mocked arrogantly or hypocritically mourning, but that it is they who are fermenting, their soul fermenting in their digital perfection body.
You get pity somehow. But wouldn't it be right anyway for the nobility or the club to ask each human being individually how they want to be? So digital or analog?
Yes, you could, but that led to very complicated arguments and disagreements with almost every species in space. When one part of a species decided to pursue a purely inward spiritual development on the one hand, and the other part of the species, despite the demonstration of possible consequences, decided in favor of the digitally existing researcher and explorer club on the other. This led to unnecessary destruction and bitter wars within a species and to other species or to the digitally existing club. Unexpectedly, those spiritual species that were doing spiritual research on their few planets and in their few populated star systems won the wars. Contracts were subsequently made that have hardly ever been broken since. Since then, the statutes of the Researchers Club that has been watching over us state that a species must remain completely intact, that is, it must not be split into different developmental strands, because that poses dangers for all species in space. But in which direction a species should then go, yes, that is why we can and may struggle. And the club has the better cards. It uses all means and tricks to enforce its philosophy on every inhabited planet or moon.
And in the middle of this field of interest and regulations are we, as humanity.
Correct. However, the role of humanity is once again a much more complicated, and also a more complex situation, as I already described it in the first interview, because the Researchers Club and also some other clubs in the universe have not yet recognized what humanity really is and what it will once stand for: the liberation from the seven-dimensional total prison. It is not just another species to be fought and struggled for, but it is creating the key to the exit. But at the moment, not even other spiritual beings in the universe can clearly see this. The digitalist species of the Researchers and Explorers Club certainly cannot, let alone understand it, because they have a completely different approach to life and existence. Although they have long been aware that they have given up something important in themselves with their way of life.
Is it impossible to talk to them about it?
Talking is possible, but admitting it and withdrawing and changing the whole thing is not. Because it's also not possible to withdraw from it, they have to continue. That is their livelihood and they cannot simply give it up, otherwise they will die. And dying would be a terrible option for these beings, because they know that then something worse could happen to their quanta and their consciousness. Well, it was and is their philosophy and ideology. Although everything is now a real dead end, a bust. And they know that. But it is just the way it is. And as long as it works, they will continue. Secretly they hope for a solution that will someday and somehow fall into their laps.
Yes, then it seems to be hopeless.
Yes. That's it. A terrible dilemma.
But let's get back to function. How does this digital journey through space work?
Perhaps I should first of all make a preliminary remark. The digital existence and the resulting quantum entangled travel through space was not used in the cosmos by the now existing researchers club at first, but was already used before that by a group of species that had disappeared a long time ago. For more than 2 billion years, they disappeared without a trace. Where they disappeared to, the ruling researchers and explorers club does not know. They officially suspect that these many species simply became extinct, for whatever reason. Perhaps because they had similar problems with their digital existence, the club suspects. But that such a large number of different species with such complex abilities simply died out is questionable. The researchers club hopes that they disappeared because they continued to evolve. And the club is secretly hoping for the same development for itself, so that there will finally be a way out of the current deadlock. But only the spiritually living and exploring species of the present cosmos, which are only on their planets and in their solar systems, have any idea where these previous disappeared species went and what happened to them.
And where did they go?
They ascended into higher dimensions through their quantum entanglement techniques and disappeared completely from dimension level 1 to 4. Do you know who I mean? Back then, billions of years ago, there were only species that traveled through space exclusively by means of quantum entanglement. There was no other mental current that explored the innermost part of being at that time. Who these species are, I will come to that in a moment.
As far as I can remember, you told me about these vanished species in the previous interview.
Yes, I was talking about that. Well, first of all you wanted to know how the technique of quantum entangled travel works. Forget everything you've heard in certain esoteric or semi-esoteric books about extraterrestrial travelers. People who supposedly traveled to the stars with extraterrestrials, or about time travelers, black holes or curvature of space, or wormholes and ultra-fast UFOs. Most of them are stories of fantasists who are encouraged and supported by levels of these elites who want to lift humanity into digital existence. This is why there are so many different stories about how the aliens are supposed to be, what drives and techniques they use to travel interstellar, and how they are organized with each other. All in the manner of Starship Enterprise and company. Everything in these stories is either very promising, or there is a struggle between good and evil species. But there is always a promising future for humanity, in contrast to all the horror that is now prevailing on Earth. But these are all just beautiful dreams, deceptions and exaggerations that have been and will be touched with pop ideas about space to make people receptive to this subject and the digital future. The fact is that there are very, very rare interstellar journeys in material spaceships that run on highly efficient energetic drives. However, when they are used, they cannot reach over light speed. As I said before, over light speed, space curvature and wormholes are absolute nonsense, which is moreover deliberately given into the lowest levels of the secret societies, so that even the semi-knowledgeable in the secret societies are encouraged to continue to stir these imposed goals and supposed secrets among the people via alternative and mainstream media. Depending on how high up they are in their secret society, they are or are not told about the actual technical conditions and goals of the club. Most of these minions remain disinformed, half-knowing and operationally blind. This is what it takes to make the whole scam of this enterprise work, to finally lead humanity into digitalization. In the meantime, however, the club and nobility leave pronounced truths standing just like that, because they know that this mixes with all the other so-called truths. The half-knowledge, the disinformation, the pop culture and the scientific dream stories about wormholes and overspeed of light, so that nobody can see through what is technically possible or what is behind all the earthly phenomena. The main thing is that people are confused enough. But now to the journeys. The digital way to travel intergalactically is based on the principles of quantum physics. For this purpose, the entire atomic and molecular structure of a living being is irreversibly put into a state in which the quantum state of the body is determined, stored, and the original material state is dissolved. This quantum storage state can then be completely restored as matter and as an originally existing living biological body. The living being is back. From now on, however, the individual is materially only available as a quantum entangled image or as a positive, and can then travel in this way to places in the universe where a quantum negative object or device is located, which the individual restores there, so to speak, as a kind of replica via quantum data transmission. Not as a copy, but as a quantum entangled negative, which is then turned back into the positive there. Actually like a kind of data transmission. But here the real quantum states are actually transferred. This means that the individual is actually still the same after the restoration, both quantum technically and biologically materially.
So then the original remains. The person is not erased or copied.
No. It is there, as an original, not a copy. But a certain quantum proportion begins to destabilize imperceptibly from the moment the digitization of biology is completed. At a later point in time, decomposition will also begin at some point. I have already mentioned that. But the individual already signs this fate before entering digital existence. Digitization creates a state in which the matter and the quantum image of a living being is decomposed, digitally reassembled and then stored, making the individual durable forever. What exactly goes wrong during this process and then later during the incipient quantum decomposition, the club, as already mentioned, does not know to this day. It cannot be changed. Perhaps it is simply not possible any other way. Well, they have long since come to terms with these halfway compensatable problems. During the transformation and storage into the quantum data state and the return into the state of matter, nothing happens yet. Nevertheless, this is the start from which the quanta are inevitably doomed to rot and erosion. Quantums that make up the free will of a conscious intelligent living being, i.e. that generate consciousness and are the soul, these quanta dissolve. This means that first the abdominal brain stinks and ferments. And then the quanta of consciousness, of the soul, of the heart, die, so to speak. Forgive me this expression, but fermenting belly brain simply describes this horrible process most accurately. The belly brain starts to stink terribly, only gases come out. If you do nothing, the soul dress begins to tatter. Intuition, free will decompose. This process of dissolving does not start or depends on how much or how long you have been existing or traveling quantum entangled, but on the stability of your own quantum field of consciousness. Usually after thousands of years there is some time, a day, an hour, in which the process of decomposition suddenly starts and then sometime accelerates enormously. This can begin sooner or later. For some people it can begin after only a few centuries. If you are lucky, only after hundreds of thousands to millions of years. But when it begins, it is the beginning of dependence on other individuals who still have the quanta of free will, or rather, still have their full unaffected analog quantum field of consciousness, like us humans for example.
Why do they have to get attached to a being that has free will?
The intuitive procedures or processes of free will of every conscious intelligent living being depend on fluctuations within their own quantum field of consciousness. This quantum field comes from a level of existence called hyperdimensional quantum consciousness, the source of all consciousness. This is the source of all our existence, of every being. So when a being in this club couples to the quantum field of consciousness, or the entire quantum state of a human being, which is fully connected to the hyperdimensional quantum consciousness, the being can once again receive true fluctuating quantum originality of the consciousness generated in all of us, the original quantum field of consciousness from which all beings in the universe are descended. Without this connection, every living being would slowly become inactive or stand still, without active consciousness. At some point, the living being would no longer have even a hint of consciousness reality or be able to consciously perceive the world. Like a stone, just a kind of zombie, will-less and soul-dead, running around in the world. So if the digital beings would not get or borrow our quanta, they would lose their connection and become zombies. Although they themselves know what kind of symptom relief therapy they have to use in order not to become unconscious, they do not know the exact effects. I.e. that by sucking out the quanta they also create a kind of connection to hyperdimensional quantum consciousness. They only know that this procedure of sucking the quanta from conscious intelligent beings helps.
This all sounds like a story about drug addicts. Although in fact it is a story about parasites that have to attach themselves to people or help themselves with people in order to be able to exist. Does this really have such an extreme effect on these parasitic individuals? Do they really become like a stone? Or was that just a metaphorical exaggeration on your part?
No. The stone is not meant metaphorically. Because a stone also has a consciousness, everything in the world of matter has a consciousness, because it was built from quantum information. Only how this acts and how it is connected to active action is regulated in stages and is defined reciprocally by mutual action. A stone just has a much lower quantum field of consciousness. In general, without consciousness, however small it may be, nothing could exist in the world of matter if you lost sight of it, i.e. if you stopped looking at it. Without an own quantum of consciousness or quantum of existence, objects, other living beings or people would simply be gone. All material things would be gone when you look away, even if you looked again afterwards. A tree that falls down in the forest would not fall down or could not exist at all if it did not possess its own quantum of consciousness or quantum of existence. If the tree did not have its own existential quanta, you could look at it, then look away, and in the next moment, when you looked at it again, it would be gone. But everything in this world consists of quantum information, and is therefore not simply gone when you don't look as presumed by today's quantum research. For a conscious intelligent being that no longer looks at the tree or stone, the tree or stone has only disappeared from the quantum consciousness world of the observer. Therefore, other conditions and other developments result, i.e. for tree, stone, and human being. They are intertwined within a quantum connection in which tree and human being meet each other quantum mechanically in their action and relationship. If man eats a plant, he does not simply kill it, but connects with it forever. If a conscious human being, or let us say a conscious primeval human being, takes a branch or a piece of wood for the first time and makes a tool out of it, the quantum mechanical process of departure for a completely new connection takes place. A connection with the material, a connection for the development of complicated, fine tools, higher machines, and finally electronic technology up to artificial intelligence. A development that is not only controlled by the conscious intelligent living being, but quantum reciprocally always controlled from both sides. The material with few own consciousness quanta and the consciously acting living being with many consciousness quanta. And this leads us, amusingly enough, to the very development we have been talking about all along in the previous interview, artificial intelligence. So, back to the stone again. The digitized individual, where the quantum loss of consciousness is accelerating, feels at some point absent and, as the process progresses, would become like a stone forever. The individual loses the feeling for his own self, similar to a patient with a dissociative disorder or clouding of consciousness. The individual can no longer feel itself, can no longer perceive itself clearly. In relation to the quantum existent being, a dysfunctional state of matter results, which deactivates the mental personality, the abilities, and the ego of the individual and, in the long term, dissolves it completely.
So nobody knows the exact causes for this problem?
No. But the trigger lies precisely in this permanently quantum-locked digital storage, a constitution, in other words, that can no longer be reversed. This state lacks will energy, or better said quanta of consciousness, which the species of that club have to suck off or borrow from individuals of other species from now on. These quanta have always been sucked out of every human being. But humans have always resisted them. And slowly they are beginning to figure out how to manage to resist them more than expected.
This suction really sounds like milking.
Yes, and the process of this milking is a completely technical affair and has nothing to do with mystical hocus-pocus, witchcraft, esotericism, or superstition. It is as banal and real as the tangible functioning of any technical principle. There is actually nothing complicated behind it if you know how to direct, exploit, manipulate, and burden living beings in order to be able to suck out the quanta. The important thing is that the individuals from whom the suction is applied are subjected to a tempting principle in which their ego takes control over their actions and thoughts. Then the parasitic being can connect and energetically tap the quanta of free will, i.e. harvest or borrow the quanta of consciousness. You could also call the quanta of consciousness soul quanta. As I already mentioned, the individuals of that club that has been stalking us have reinterpreted this shameful parasitic procedure for themselves in a pragmatic way of thinking and justified it philosophically and morally. because one day humanity itself would need to suck the quanta out of other beings in the cosmos. So people are already now making advance payments, so to speak. The end justifies the means, one hand washes the other. Besides, there would be no other solution to this problem, which for some of the club species looks like a destiny or an invisible natural regulation for the further expansion of this parasitic way of life.
Why did you talk about borrowing soul quanta in addition to harvesting? Is there a difference? Do some of these beings simply borrow human quanta and then return them at some point?
No, they do not return them. At least not voluntarily. However, any tapped individual can retrieve their quantum of consciousness or soul if they activate the remaining quanta of their free will. By ignoring the instincts and egoisms implanted in the individual, such as greed, selfishness, diffuse or real fears, resentment, hatred, etc., i.e. by consciously ignoring superficial temptations, resisting them, consciously doing the right thing, the constructive, the brave, the courageous, the quanta return to the robbed being. If you persevere and resist this, it is as if you are pulling the stolen quanta, sometimes along with the energy it contains, from the extractor back to yourself, as if pulling on a long string. This causes the extractor to rotate completely, literally. The extractor then struggles not to lose them, but often it simply has to give them back because in the long run they would cause the extractor more trouble than good if it were to keep them spasmodically. That is why I said borrow, because it is possible that a conscious intelligent being might take back its quanta.